Welcome everyone to HSAA's Union Talk Speaker Series. Tonight's theme is energy transformation, and we are lucky to have two exciting speakers tonight. My name is Heather Normandale, and I'm privileged to serve as one of your Calgary District Board members. Tonight's evening is being live streamed, and we want to welcome any HSAA members, members of other unions, and members of the public who are watching online. We invite your participation, and please send us your questions as we go. After the talks, we will have some time for Q&A, and our speakers will do their best to answer your questions. I want to introduce you to our two speakers tonight. First, we have Gil McGowan. Gil McGowan is the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, Alberta's largest union advocacy organization. Gil, a father of three, has presided over a period of substantial growth for the AFL. He has led public discussion and policy changes on resource development, reform of the temporary foreign worker program, climate change and green jobs, a $15 minimum wage, pension reform, reforms to the Labour Code and employment standards, and reforms to occupational health and safety and WCB legislation. In 2015, Gil was named one of Alberta's 50 most influential people. Gil sits on the CLC's Canadian Council and was co-chair of the Energy Diversification Advisory Committee, and was recently appointed to the Federal Just Transition Task Force to support transition strategies for workers and communities affected by the coal phase-out. After Gil, we will have Julia Maria Becker. Julia Marie Becker is the director of Pembina Institute's Clean Economy Program in Alberta. She works on corporate, government, and community-based sustainability projects in Alberta relating to clean economy with a focus on energy efficiency and carbon pricing. Before joining the Pembina Institute, Canada's leading energy think tank, Julia worked for an international organization, Student Energy, where she led the energy literacy platform. She is now on the board of directors of Student Energy. She also worked at Alberta Eco Trust, where she was responsible for the organization's Social Innovation Lab. Julia has worked for the German and Mexican Government Institute and has a Master of Development Economics and a Bachelor of International Economics. She's involved in a local community group that brings together citizens to discuss climate change and has participated in panel discussions on the clean energy transition throughout Alberta and at international conferences in Europe, Mexico, and Canada. Thank you everyone for attending and participating.
Well, thanks, Heather, and thanks to HSA for hosting this event. It's very timely because energy is always on the mind of Albertans. We are an oil and gas province, and those conversations are getting even more focused in the lead up to what will be our next provincial election. The Premier hasn't announced when that election will be held yet, but it will probably take place sometime in the next few weeks or a few months. You know, there are many issues that Albertans are concerned about. HSA represents healthcare workers, so many of our members are concerned about healthcare, public services. But if you look at the public opinion polls, or if you base your opinion based on conversations with ordinary Albertans, your friends, your coworkers, I think most people would agree that the top issue going into this election will probably be the economy. And when we talk about the economy in the Alberta context, we are by and large talking about the oil and gas sector. And there's absolutely no doubt that our oil and gas sector has gone through a rough patch. I'm actually going to canvass the room. How many people feel anxious about the economy? Okay. And that would be consistent with what we see with you know, any group of Albertans. If you gather people in a public sector workplace, a private sector workplace, if you're talking with your family or your friends, if there's one constant in Alberta politics today, it is anxiety, and some people might even say fear about the future, and especially anxiety and fear about the future of our economy. There's a sense among many Albertans that what we're experiencing here is something different. And if you're feeling that way, I would suggest that you're right. There is something that is ailing our economy, and you know, when you have a patient that is ailing, and as healthcare workers, you'll know that the diagnosis is key. If you get the wrong diagnosis, you'll probably get the wrong treatment, and if you have the wrong treatment, that actually might make the patient worse. It's the same with the economy. So the question I think that's on a lot of people's minds is, what is ailing Alberta's economy? And that's what I want to address today. And I would like to suggest to you today that what we're experiencing is not another boom bust cycle, which Albertans have become so familiar with as a oil and gas producing jurisdiction, a place that sells commodities that ride that roller coaster of price up and down. We're used to booms and busts, but what we're experiencing right now is nothing short of a transformation to the foundations of the oil and gas economy. And if we want to make informed decisions about public policy and even about who to vote for in the next election, and especially if your top issue is the economy, I think people have to get the right diagnosis, what's ailing our economy. And so I've mentioned the word transformation. Today I want to talk to you about, from our perspective in the labor movement, what we describe as an energy transformation. And it's a transformation that has three dimensions. The first dimension has to do with our neighbor to the south. So this is a slide that shows oil production from the United States. And as recently as 2010, so less than a decade ago, the United States was producing on average about 5.5 million barrels of oil a day. But what you can see by looking at this chart is that level of production increased, and not by a little bit. It nearly tripled over the course of 8 years. And this had largely to do with technology. And if you're an Albertan, you've heard the words. You may not actually understand the technology, you may not have used it yourself, but you certainly heard it in the media. Maybe some of your family members who work in the industry have told you about it. And the technology I'm talking about is fracking and horizontal drilling. Those two technologies together have unlocked a bonanza of production in the United States from oil and gas formations that previously had been considered to be tapped. So when you hear things like the Permian Basin, that's the biggest oil and gas formation that has been unlocked by these new technologies. The Permian Basin is actually not new. It lies under almost all of Texas, and it's what made Texas, Texas. But using older technology, they couldn't squeeze that much more oil out of it. But with fracking technology, there was an explosion of production. It allowed for an explosion of production. Now this is significant. This is significant for a number of reasons. And the first and most obvious reason that it's significant is because the United States is our biggest customer. And this may surprise people. And most Albertans understand that we are an exporting province. Our main export is oil, natural gas, or products made from oil and natural gas. But what I don't think a lot of people realize is that fully 99% of our international exports go to one market. They go to the United States. And what we see here is that our customer has become much more self-sufficient. So they can supply more of their own needs. And in a sense, our biggest customer has become our biggest competitor. One of the other results of the dramatic spike in oil production from the United States is the effect that it had on price. And I think most people understand sort of economics 101, when you're producing a commodity and the supply goes up beyond demand, then price goes down. And what happened here, this is a graph showing the price for what they call West Texas Intermediate, which is the benchmark price for oil produced in the United States. And what you'll see, and people will remember this, in the period of the long boom from 2004 to 2014, oil was trading at very high prices. So it briefly touched on $140 a barrel. in 2011, 2012. But for most of that period, it was trading over $90 a barrel, $100 a barrel, and it's something that we got used to, and it actually drove our economy here in Alberta. But what you see is in 2014 and the beginning of 2015, the price of oil fell off the cliff, and it is related to this previous slide. So not only were the Americans nearly tripling their production, it upset the global supply-demand balance. It created gluts, oversupply, and so we had more oil sloshing around the world than there was demand for. That situation was actually exacerbated, and you may have seen this in the news too. The Saudi Arabians felt the Americans nipping at their heels. The Saudis were the biggest oil producer in the world, but all of a sudden the Americans were catching up to them in terms of production. And in fact, just last year, the Americans surpassed the Saudis to become the largest oil producer in the world. I'm not sure a lot of people realize that. But what the Saudis tried to do is maintain their market share by trying to drive their American competitors out of business. And they did that by opening their taps. They increased their production at the same time that the Americans were increasing production. So there was already a glut, and they added more production on top of that glut. And so not only did it lead to low prices, it led to a collapse in prices. So oil went from near $110 a barrel to $35 a barrel in the course of about six months. That also happens to correspond with almost exactly the time that Rachel Notley and the New Democrats won the election in 2015. This chart, what this chart shows is the correlation between price and investment. So not only did price collapse because of the ramp up in production, it set off what some people in oil and gas talk about as the iron law of investment. Investment in oil and gas follows price. And what this graph shows is the relationship between the price of oil, which is depicted in the dark blue line, the relationship between the price and levels of investment. And as you can see, they track each other. When price goes up, investment goes up. When price goes down, investment goes down. And this is a little bit of a closer look, zooming in on the years around the time of the crash. So you'll see that in 2014, when the price of oil was high, when the prices started collapsing, investment followed. So this is not Alberta. This is not the United States. This is global investment in oil and gas. So all the oil and gas companies in the world. We saw a collapse in investment of 25% between 2014 and 2015, and another collapse of investment by 26% between 2015 and 2016. So two very, very bad years. It leveled out in 2016, 2017, but it was a dramatic drop around the world. And I stress around the world because here in Alberta, it is easy to think that what's happening to us is only happening to us. But this was actually happening to all oil-producing jurisdictions around the world. And I think it's also important that it was happening to the same extent in all oil-producing jurisdictions around the world in terms of the drop of the effective price on investment. So here we have a chart of US investment in the oil and gas sector, and between the years 2014, which was the year before the price collapse, and then the subsequent years, and 2014 is in blue, and then the following years are in the other colors. And what you can see, and these are the quarters, quarter 1, 2, 3, 4 of each year. And so you see that the investment was very healthy in the United States in oil and gas. In 2014, it collapsed. In 2015, it collapsed further in 2016, and it stayed low in 2017 and 2018. And I throw this up because Albertans have been conditioned not to believe this. How many times have you heard that investment is fleeing Alberta and our nasty socialist policies to be invested in other oil-producing jurisdictions? So the money is going to Texas, the money is going to Saskatchewan, which is a conservative province. But what this chart shows is that the money was not going to Texas. The money was not being invested. It wasn't being invested in Alberta. It wasn't being invested in the United States. It wasn't being invested in any oil producing jurisdiction around the world. This chart actually compares Alberta to Saskatchewan in terms of the drop in investment during this period that we've been talking about. And so you can see Alberta appropriately is represented by the orange bar. Saskatchewan is represented by the blue bar, and this is the drop in investment in the oil and gas sector in the two provinces in 2015, 16, and 17. And so you can see that the declines were almost exactly the same, even though we had two very different governments in the two provinces. So that's the first dimension of the energy transformation. Our biggest customer, as a result of technology, became our biggest competitor, flooded the world markets. But there's a second dimension of the energy transformation, and it has to do with how oil companies, both here in Alberta and around the world, how they responded to the first dimension. So prices has collapsed, and how did companies respond to this, this new low price environment? Well, they responded in the way that companies often do. I mean, first they lowered the amount that they were investing, but they also dramatically cut back on costs, their day-to-day costs. And I don't, HSA is a union. We're all union members, so we're very familiar with what employers do, especially in the private sector, but also in the public sector, when confronted by constrained revenue. They cut costs, and they do that primarily by cutting people. The interesting thing, and I think the very significant thing about what oil and gas companies did here in Alberta and around the world is that they dramatically scaled up their use of technology to replace workers. So the example that we have on the screen here is one that people in the audience today have probably heard about. It involves Suncor's decision to replace their current fleet of trucks with a new fleet of trucks that don't require drivers. Okay, so as it stands right now, literally every truck that is operating on the Suncor site, these are those iconic heavy haul trucks. When people think of the oil sands, they think of these big trucks. Every single truck that's on the Suncor site now, even if it is currently being driven by a human being, it has been designed for conversion to automation. Okay, and this process is happening already. People are we're actually in the process of seeing people laid off, and it's going to affect as many as 400 drivers, but it'll probably be more than that because it'll also affect maintenance people as well. And that's just at one company. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Basically, every oil company around the world has been very aggressive in using technology to displace workers. Another example is company, and you've probably heard about drilling companies like Precision Drilling, Ensign Drilling. You see their trucks running around on the highways all the time. They are introducing a new generation of drilling rigs, which used to require 12, 15 people to operate. But with the new technologies, they can do the same work with 2 people. And this kind of thing is happening throughout the sector. So, but this is also happening at the same time that production is going up. So you saw that graph of production in the United States, almost tripling in 8 years. The trajectory on production in the United States continues to go up at a steep rate. And same is true here in Alberta. What we're seeing as a result of technology driven by an effort to cut costs is a decoupling between investment levels, production levels, and employment levels. And once again, this is important, especially in the context of the election, because a lot of people on the political stage here in Alberta have been trying to, give us this message that it's Alberta, that the Alberta government policies are driving jobs out of the province. And if you look at the numbers, so this is a graph showing how many oil and gas jobs were lost in Alberta. From the top to the bottom of the recession, we lost about 40,000 jobs. but you can see that a lot of them have come back. This is Texas. Texas lost more jobs than we did. Okay, Texas lost they had more people working in the oil and gas sector than we did, and they lost a lot of them too. So, so those are the first two dimensions of this transformation that is sweeping through the global oil and gas economy. You know, our biggest customer has become our biggest competitor. Companies are responding by using automation to replace people, and production has become decoupled from employment. The final two factors that affect our oil and gas sector and therefore our economy, one is Alberta specific, the other is global. The Alberta specific one is the one that we tend to hear most about, and it has to do with pipelines. So when people tell you that we have a pipeline problem, it's true. However, as I've just explained, it's only part of the problem. But it is also very serious. So this is a chart that was prepared by the National Energy Board, which is the regulator for oil and gas in Alberta. And the dark line shows Alberta oil production, 85% from the oil sands. And as I said before, you can see that production continued to go up, and it's in a pretty much a steady line, even though there was a recession. There's one noticeable dip. You guys know what this is? That dip right there? That's the Fort McMurray fire. Okay, so it dipped there. So the black line is production, and it's on its way up. The shaded areas are what they call takeaway capacity from pipelines. So this is how many barrels every day we can load in pipelines and ship out to markets. And what you'll notice, I'm going to walk over to the other side. Right here at the end of the chart, you'll see production exceeds takeaway capacity. So this is October, last October 2018, when our production officially exceeded our ability to take it away in pipelines. Okay, the result was this. Okay, so this chart shows the price of what they call Western Canadian Select, is what we call our benchmark for Alberta heavy crude, so diluted bitumen. Always trades at a discount, so don't let anyone tell you that we can get world prices for our bitumen, because they're telling you a story that shouldn't be believed. Partly because it needs more processing to be refined to be usable, so that costs money, and also it costs more to transport. Okay, so it's always going to be sold for a discount. But what we saw when the pipelines filled up in October, the price collapsed, and it was very quick, right? And so the price collapsed, and for a couple of days, the spot price for Western Canadian Select was actually negative. And so you'll remember at the time there was a flurry of activity in the legislature, and in the towers in downtown Calgary, what to do about this. And this is when the Premier settled on her policy of so-called curtailment, which basically means putting a supply cap. And so they agreed to impose a cap on all producers, reducing their production so the pipelines would no longer be filled. Interestingly, as soon as that policy was introduced, it shot right back up so fast that it tells you it's more of a financial thing than a real thing. It was about the futures markets. They trade ahead about what they think is going to happen, and so the people who were trading the future barrels of oil were confident that the curtailment would work, and it did. So that brings us to the third dimension. This is the final dimension of the energy transformation. Okay, and arguably this is the most significant, and it's also the least talked about. And so what this chart is, this is a chart based on a report that was released by the Energy Information Administration, which is basically the U.S. Department of Energy, which is one of the sort of gold standard reporting agencies for oil and gas. And they released their annual projections for demand last year. And these are significant because oil companies look to the EIA and other national agencies that make these predictions they look to them for information to base their decisions about investment on. And so when they were predicting how much demand there would be for oil going forward, they produced 3 scenarios. The first is what they call the current policy scenario. So that's basically business as usual. If nothing changes, what will demand for oil, the stuff that we sell, what will it look like in the next 20 years? And you can see that we're not here. We're close to here. So world oil demand right now is almost 100 million barrels a day, and they're estimating that if nothing changes, it'll go up to about 120 million barrels a day. So an increase of about 2% every year. And so if you read the business pages in the Calgary Herald, if you listen to the business news, this is the scenario that or something like it, this is what they talk about. They say everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. The world will continue buying what we're selling, and we don't have to do anything different. This is just another bust, and things will recover. And that's what Alberta governments and Alberta policy leaders have been doing for years. I mean, if you want to boil down Alberta economic planning over the last 40 years, it's like, wait for the next boom. That's pretty much it. Okay. However, the EIA and the International Energy Agency, which is a UN and then a whole bunch of other private forecasting agencies, they say that's one scenario, but there are others. Okay. So for the EIA and their forecast, the second scenario is what they call new policy scenario, which basically says, okay, governments have committed to certain things, climate related, fuel efficiency, that kind of stuff. And they say, well, let's model what the demand is going to look like if they actually implement all these things that they've already committed to. In that scenario, you can see that the future demand is actually much less robust. It's pretty flat. Okay. The final scenario is what they call the sustainability scenario. And this scenario basically says, what will future oil demand look like if the world gets serious about climate change? If they live up to commitments, if countries around the world live up to the commitments that they made under the Paris Accord and start to recognize that we have a challenge on our hands. That's what happens. So instead of 120 million barrels a day of oil demand, we could be looking at a scenario of 70 million barrels of oil a day. So that's a 30% decline from today. And what they're saying is that under this scenario, the global demand for oil would peak not 20 years from now, not 50 years from now. It would peak in about 5 or 6 years, okay? And then start going down very precipitously. And our position as a labor movement, representing not just public sector workers, but we represent private sector workers, including many people who work in the energy industry, including in exploration, refining, upgrading, petrochemicals, the whole enchilada. Our argument is irresponsible to put all of our eggs in the basket of the business as usual scenario. And in fact, looking at what's happening in terms of geopolitical politics and the conversations that are going on around the world about climate change, we are convinced that we have to pay attention to the sustainability scenario and what it would mean for our economy. And the reason we say that is because the world is finally waking up to climate change, right? So, and 2018 was a watershed year in that regard. So it was a year characterized by record heat waves, killer heat waves. It was a year characterized by biblical floods that were attributable to climate change. It was a year that here in Western Canada, our skies were literally choked by smoke from unprecedented wildfires. And scientists are saying that that's going to happen every year now, instead of being an anomaly. It was also the year when the International Panel on Climate Change concluded that we have 12 years to turn things around to avoid a climate catastrophe. And finally, it was the year when all the nations of the world got together to follow up on the Paris Accord and actually came up with a work plan to reduce emissions. So this idea that everything's just going to be hunky-dory and that the future is going to look like the past, I would argue, and we would argue as a labor movement, that that's irresponsible. And the future is actually probably going to look more like the sustainable development scenario than it will look like the business as usual scenario. So that's a long way of saying the patient is ailing, and people are right in Alberta when they say that our economy is ailing. But the diagnosis is a lot more complex than what we've been led to believe. Pipelines are part of the issue, but they're not the whole issue. So really what we're talking about is a fundamental transformation of our energy economy. US fracking has changed the fundamentals of global oil markets. The global supply-demand balance has been transformed. The world is now awash with oil. And you remember when everyone thought we were going to run out of oil? Now it's the opposite problem. Now prices will be lower, not just for longer. Some people are saying they'll probably be lower forever. So boom and bust has been replaced by a steady downward slog for the price of oil. And as a result, investment will remain sluggish, especially in expensive mega projects like the oil sands. But for a province like Alberta that relies on oil and gas, it gets worse. Companies are responding by cutting costs and cutting jobs. They've learned how to produce more with fewer people. And finally, as I've said, the world is moving away from fossil fuels and demand will dry up. And in the context of the election, I think it's really important to recognize that all of the things that I've discussed have nothing to do with the policy of any one government in any one jurisdiction. I know it's a natural human tendency to look for scapegoats, to point fingers, but in this case, it's more like a tornado. We got hit by a tornado, we got hit by a storm, it was out of our control, it wasn't caused by anyone in particular. It's all about global trends, which we can't control, but which we argue we must adapt to. So I know I've taken a lot of time, so I'm just going to wrap up with a very quick overview of what we in the labor movement are suggesting as the cure. What is the prescription for the diagnosis that I've just presented? We got together as a labor movement, all the 29 unions of the Federation of Labor, including public sector unions like HSAA, but also unions representing people in energy and construction and manufacturing. And we asked ourselves, so given that the world is changing, given that the oil and gas economy is being transformed and that this is not just another boom and bust cycle, what should we as Albertans be doing in terms of public policy to prepare us to adapt to this change? And in a nutshell, I'm gonna say there are 4 or 5 things. I'm gonna go through them quickly. And the first is, and this may seem counterintuitive, support the Alberta oil and gas sector. Because it's not done yet. Even if global oil demand does drop by 30%, the world will continue using oil. So in the near term, we have to, and this is where the pipeline debate comes in, but it's not our point is it's not the whole debate, it's part of the debate. The new pipeline, we need to get access to markets other than the United States. Okay, so our biggest customers become our biggest competitor. As much as we can, we have to find other markets, mostly in Asia, for our products. That's the short term. Second, we need to incentivize and support the greening of our oil and gas industry. Now, why do I say that? Okay, and this is something that Albertans really have to understand. We are heavy oil producers. So as I said, the oil demand every year is about 100 million barrels a day. Heavy oil demand is only about 10 million. So that's the market that we sell into. In that market, we're competing against countries like Venezuela, Mexico, Nigeria, and to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia. And those are all countries that have done almost nothing to reduce their emissions, like almost nothing. And so when you hear oil sands companies like Suncor, Cenovus, when they got up on the stage with Premier Notley to announce the climate leadership plan, they said we must become cost competitive and carbon competitive. That's what they were talking about. And what they're foreseeing, they were actually planning for that sustainability scenario with the drop in demand. And they're saying, as the world becomes increasingly stringent about environmental standards and emission standards, if we want to keep selling to these markets with more stringent standards, we have to be the cleanest heavy oil producer in the world. And so the goal would be here not to continue selling our oil in perpetuity, because that's probably not going to happen, but that as we move away from fossil fuels in that process, which will probably take 40, 50, 60 years, that we would be the last heavy oil producer standing, okay? And so we want to use the wealth that's generated by being the last heavy oil producer standing to help build a bridge to a greener economy, and to do that very consciously. And the final thing I'll say before I get the hook is that in addition to helping our existing oil and gas industry to adapt to a economy that is increasingly moving away from fossil fuels, and to make sure that we're the last heavy oil producer standing, we also have to acknowledge that we have to diversify. This is something that Albertans have been talking about for years. It has to move from rhetoric to reality. And so we need to diversify within the oil and gas sector, doing things like pivoting towards the downstream, so added value, petrochemicals, partial upgrading. So instead of exporting our raw product, we would add value and keep the jobs and then export a finished product. And then also diversifying beyond oil and gas. And in conclusion, I just want to say that, especially in the context of the election, the reason that this understanding is important is because A, we're trying to demonstrate what our economy really needs to be competitive and to create jobs and to maintain prosperity. And what we really need is a government that recognizes that there's a change going on and it's not just another boom bust. B, we need a government that's willing to look at our existing oil industry in a different way and understand that incentives have to be given to help that industry become greener so that we can be the last heavy oil producer standing. And then C, we need a government that's willing to put policies in place and even money in place to help diversify both within the oil and gas economy and beyond. And if that's the policy prescription that our province needs, and we in the labor movement feel very strongly that it is, then we have to measure the candidates and the parties against that. And what we've seen is that the UCP denies that change is happening. They actively argue against this notion that this is anything more than a usual boom and bust. They point fingers of blame instead of recognizing that this is a fundamental foundational shift. And when it comes to greening the oil and gas industry, they don't recognize that greening our industry is the way to preserve the industry, right? They don't understand that. And so they don't understand the link between the climate leadership plan and even the dreaded carbon tax. The carbon tax revenue, a lot of it's going back to Albertans in forms of rebates, but a lot of it is also going into an innovation fund that's helping our oil sands companies reduce their emissions. So it's exactly what we need at this time in our history. And so we have a government right now that understands the problem, that is investing in innovation, that is helping industry to reduce emissions, that is helping to ensure that we're going to be the last heavy oil producer standing, that is in terms of diversification, they've leveraged $12.5 billion of downstream projects just this year in petrochemicals and partial upgrading. And of course, they're diversifying beyond oil and gas. Alberta has become one of the premier destinations for investment in renewable and green energy. So if there is a government that could take us through, that can show us, that could take us through this challenge, it's the one we have. And I'm going to conclude by saying that given everything that I've said about this transformation that's happening, how we think as a labor movement, we should respond in order to preserve and create jobs and to build a bridge to a greener future. If that's our goal, then Jason Kenney is the last thing that we need. So when people say, You know, I don't like Jason Kenney because he's going to attack healthcare. We don't like Jason Kenney because he's social conservative. We don't like Jason Kenney because he's going to, you know, cut back education. But I'm going to hold my nose and vote for him anyway because of the economy. What this analysis shows is that if you're concerned about jobs, if you're concerned about the future, if you're concerned about ensuring prosperity in our province for the next generation and subsequent generations, then Jason Kenney and the UCP and his crowd of energy dinosaurs are literally the last thing that we need in this province at this moment. Thank you.
Okay, and if I go over time, then you will help me stay in time. So yeah, my name is Julia Maria Becker, and I'm with the Pembina Institute. And the Pembina Institute is, we are leading think tank around energy transition to more sustainable energy future. And we are Alberta based and born and bred, but we also have offices in Toronto and Vancouver. And I wanted to talk, so it's very fitting to what Gil was talking about. It's kind of a complementary presentation talking about how the sustainable transition fits together with a more diversified economy. But I also wanted to go a little bit back in, apart from why all of this transition or transformation to a different energy economy makes sense, apart from diversifying the economy and being less dependent on only one income resource and not only putting all eggs in one bag, there's also this environmental and pollution aspect that is part of this transformation that makes sense and why we are part of this and where the world is going. So I hope to put everything a little bit into a context around environmental aspects and pollution and global trends. So climate change. And this is just something like a little reminder. I can see often we refer to climate change, but it is more like every now and then it's good to get a little bit of a reminder what we are talking about. So climate change is a change in climate pattern. It's not talking about the weather, and it's not just because it's really cold right now, doesn't mean climate change is not happening. So climate change is something that refers to an extended period of time, and it's also referring to, at the moment we talk about climate change. When we refer to it, it's about the climate change that has been caused through increased human activities in our current last 100 years. So no one is saying that, oh, is this, did I do? Oh, okay, thank you. So no one is saying that in the past, the climate didn't change, but so this is a graph that shows 800,000 years of weather data, and it shows the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. So as you can see, over the last 800,000 years, there have been changes. It's gone up and down, but it never went over 300. 300 is kind of, remember something? 800,000 years. Oh, I have to mute the mic. Sorry people. Okay, burning. Okay, so, well, this is more interactive. Good. So in 800,000 years, didn't change. Was like going up and down, but never crossed the 300 parts per millimeter. And then when if I go back, you can see something changed here when 0. So we're zooming in. What happened? Since the Industrial Revolution, there has been an increase in burning fossil fuels. So an increase in consuming coal, burning oil, burning gas, and all of that has increased the greenhouse gas emissions. So that says global fossil fuels emissions have increased. And what can we conclude out of that? There is a correlation between, so again, we think about the 800,000 years. There's a correlation between the amount of CO2 that is in the atmosphere and the temperature on our Earth. So we had this, you can see there's this correlation, 800,000 years, that's what we know, 300 parts per milliliter, but we have no idea how this is gonna turn out. And this is where we are right now. We're in this phase of an increase in the parts in CO2 in the atmosphere that we've never seen. So this leads to greenhouse gas effect that is now in a state that we don't know how it's going to look like for us in the future. So when we talk about the Paris Agreement and we talk about accords to reduce our emissions, that is about how can we try to reduce the emissions that have been produced additionally to what normally has been happening around emissions productions in our world. Does that make sense? I know it's very complicated and I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm trying to get us all on the same page that there is a need to address the emissions that have been caused by our activities, by an increase in burning coal and burning fossil fuels. Does that make sense? I'm looking around, there's nodding, okay. What are the impacts of climate change? The impacts are that we have, as Gil already mentioned, there's an increase in extreme weather patterns. So no one is saying that there haven't been wildfires before or there haven't been floods before. But what we know is that these weather events, the changes in the weather patterns, it's going to be more and it's going to be more extreme. And something that I think about a lot is that we live in a like Canada is an amazing place, and I'm from Germany, so I grew up in a wonderful place where I know that when there's a flood, there's an insurance company taking care of me and there's going to be support. But countries in the developing world are much less supported and are suffering even more, and they are the ones that are already suffering a lot from climate change. So that's another reason why, apart from making sure that the weather is not going to get worse even more, we have to also think about how it affects our global community. And we can already see the climate change patterns changing in Alberta. So this is just an overview. It's pretty cool if you want to play around this website. And you can see how the temperature has changed over the last 60 years in Alberta. So this is just something that I thought whoever's interested might be interested in clicking around how the temperatures changed in their place and where they're from. And this leads, like realizing this and the need to address these emissions has led to the Paris Agreement that Gil already mentioned. And the Paris Agreement is this agreement that 195 countries signed to say like, okay, let's figure this out. So 195 countries sat together and said like, okay, we have to figure this out, we have to move forward, we have to address these emissions while take care of each other, finance, support developing countries, figure out the financing of this transition, figuring out the adaptation to the things that are already happening. So you can see that this is the global CO2 emissions, and this is what we need to get to our commitments under the Paris Agreement. The reductions that are needed, and what Gil already mentioned with, we have 12 years to figure it out. It's like, oh, whoa, yeah, we have to really work hard on it. So how does Alberta fit into this? So Alberta, these are the emissions from Alberta, and you can see this is 2013, and I thought it's like just, you can, the trajectory was going from 267 to 230, and it was in 2015, this was the trajectory of Alberta's emissions. And I thought it's interesting to understand where the different emissions are coming from. And it's just like without any interactions, this was the pathway that we were on. So instead of going down, we were on this pathway of going up. And this is just an overview on how it looks again, where the different emissions are coming from and how per capita, for being a relatively small jurisdictions, per capita in Alberta, we have 67 tons per person. So, and for example, Germany, where I'm from, we have 11 tons per person, but that obviously doesn't take into account like what you produce, right? But it's just like putting things into perspective on where we are. And also within Canada, when you think about if we want to, as a country, commit and achieve our responsibility within the climate targets, Alberta is pretty much at the center of us in Canada being successful. Almost 40% of the emissions come from Alberta. So if we don't figure it out here, if we don't find a way, it has to happen here. We have to figure out a way here to reduce the emissions so that actually Canada can like advance on its trajectory to contribute to the climate targets. So this is another, so apart from Gil's perspective around diversifying the economy and like kind of disrupting these global trends and that we are kind of connected to, there's also this is where the world is going. The global community is addressing the emissions, and we should be part of it and be part of this general, not movement, but like this general transition of a lower carbon economy within the global environment. Anything that does make, if there's something, if I use the wrong word or something does make sense, please ask me, because yeah, as you figured out, English is my third language, so yeah. So what has happened? So this is like in 2015, as you all know, there was a change in government, the NDP came in place, and I was like, okay, we know that this is an issue. We know that we have to address these emissions. We know we have to like be part of where the world is going. So let's figure out what we can do. And they came up with the climate leadership plan. And I thought it's always interesting. It's good to know like what is part of this climate leadership plan. I feel like sometimes people throw it around and then it's like, what is this actually about? So the climate leadership plan consists of different parts of it. So one thing is the carbon levy or the carbon tax that you've probably have heard of, but this is, and at the center of it is the carbon levy, but it has different additional parts that are there to complement and make the carbon levy more successful. So there's the coal phase out, the renewables, and like increasing renewables, energy efficiency, reducing methane emissions, and then also having a cap on the emissions from the oil sands. So the carbon levy, Gil already mentioned it, there is the revenue that comes from the carbon levy is reinvested into the economy, and at the and another part of it is there to support low-income, middle-income households and small business tax cuts. So this is actually hot off the press. I'm gonna publish a report next week, so you're the first ones to see this. This is how the money is distributed that comes from the carbon levy. So the idea with the carbon levy or with the price on pollution is this typical, just the idea of using a market signal and using how we behave with prices to influence the use of something that pollutes our common good, that is the air, that is the environment. So by pricing carbon and by pricing the emissions, you can incentivize less of these emissions, because it goes through three ways, right? You put a price on something, and then the market or producers or consumers can choose to either consume less of that product, or they produce it more efficiently, so they use less and have to pay less, or they choose to consume the same but pay more for it. And all the revenue that comes out of it is then, and that's really an interesting conversation. So when people are talking about not having carbon pricing, it's like, it is the most effective way to address emissions at the lowest cost for the economy. Everything else would be regulation. You would have to like put a law into place, then you would have to look if people are complying with it. So it's much more effective to just use a pricing signal to incentivize the behavior that you want to have. And the revenue that comes out of it is then something that you can discuss on how you want to use that. In the case of Alberta, as you can see, it has been used to support small businesses, low and middle income households, and then all these different areas around assisting Indigenous communities, coal phase out, supporting the just transition, supporting communities that have been affected by the coal phase out, green infrastructure. You might have heard of the Calgary Green Line. They got 1.4 billion committed through that. Energy efficiency is something big. So all of this revenue, you can either say like the spectrum goes from giving everything back or giving parts of it back and investing into certain areas. So there are different interpretations how to use the revenue of the carbon revenue. And if you hear like, oh, this is like whatever, this is like something new or something like unknown, 70 jurisdictions around the world already have carbon pricing. The European Union has it for a while. Alberta was actually the first jurisdiction in Northern America to have a price on carbon, but it was only put on large emitters, so a lot of people don't know that. But actually Alberta started a carbon pricing in Northern America, which I think is pretty cool. As a geeky person, I think it's pretty cool. So, and then you have like all these other places. For example, there's also China, who has a price on pollution. Who knew that? That China has a price on pollution. So in all these different places, it is where the world is going. Why wouldn't we be part of that and see, like, instead of going backwards and discuss the need for carbon pricing, it's a given. It's the lowest economic cost way to reduce emissions. And instead of discussing if, we should discuss how we want to use the revenue and where do we want to invest it and what makes most sense for us. And how do we want to, this feeds back to what Gil said, how we want to diversify our economy. Do we want to just give it back to the people, or do we want to make sure that there are different sectors that now get enhanced and supported and growing? So one of the things that you might also have heard about carbon pricing, that it's negatively affecting the economy. There's no proof of that. So this is showing how the economies that had a price on carbon in 2018, so this is Ontario still in there because they had still until the middle of the year until Ford dismantled the system. There was still this price on pollution in Ontario. So all these, the strongest economies in Canada, have a price on pollution in 2018, and their economies did well. And now it's a federal policy. So now there is in all jurisdictions in Canada a price on pollution or carbon tax. So any questions on that? Because it could be, no? Yes? Awesome. In 2007. So 2007 was the large emitters. So it was called SGER, S-G-E-R, specific gas emitters regulation, and then specified gas emitters regulation. And then 2017, you had the carbon tax that was introduced. So now the whole economy is covered. And 2018, they improved the SGER, and now it's called CCIR, and adjusted it and improved the system to address the large emitters. Okay, so a part I thought like just giving 10 minutes. I think Gil stole some of my minutes. I'm blaming it on Gil now. Okay, so then you get a fast version of this. Thank you, Gil. I think you owe me now a glass of wine. Okay, so other parts of the climate leadership plan, fast track, the oil sands, and I'm happy to chat over about this after. Oil sands emissions limit, the methane reductions, the coal phase out. I thought that is something interesting for health professionals. There is this direct connection between reducing emissions from electricity produced from coal plants to how it's directly impacting health. So by shutting that down, we made a calculation that is going to get shared soon, where you can already in 2018, premature deaths were prevented in a range between 18 and 30 just in 1 year because of the accelerated coal phase out and the price on pollution in Alberta. So that is pretty amazing. Another thing that I think is pretty cool, the increase in investment in energy efficiency. Alberta until 2017 was the only jurisdiction in North America without energy efficiency programs for consumers, which is not a cool thing to be known for. So I thought this is cool. This is a map, my heat. We are, somewhere here. Oh, here. So here you can see how energy efficient the houses are around you. It's a map you can click on. It's called My Heat, and you can see how your house is performing. Oops. And energy efficiency Alberta, by investing 100 million and in the last year, this is all the things that came out of through investing in energy efficiency. So again, talking about diversifying the economy, energy efficiency is another sector that different jobs independent from global oil prices, independent from different global trends. So it's local, you have different jobs, and through the last year, and the investments happening in energy efficiency, already 3,600 jobs have been created. So renewables, that's another part of the climate leadership plan. You might know that, or you're very lucky here with your blue skies. Alberta is one of the best wind and solar, has one of the best wind and solar resources in Canada. No, like compared to Germany, the amount of sunshine that you get here is amazing. So this just shows this map, the potential that the province has. And the government has made really smart decisions around how to procure that. So when you hear these horror stories from Ontario about increases in electricity prices, there was because they were early adopters and they got into some contracts that weren't, well, they did a better job here. They did a way better job here in the contracts and how they procure the electricity on renewables. And they did an amazing job by procuring the lowest renewables cost in Canada with the first round around renewables. So you can see, and this is just the latest contract around solar investment that has happened for government procurement that was just announced like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So that you can see how it's fitting into general prices. So when you think about, when people are saying like, it's too expensive, that's not the case anymore. Also, when you think about volatility of prices, like natural gas prices being very low right now, but who knows? It's dependent on a resource, right? But sun is going to be there and wind is going to be there. So it's a good way to diversify also, again, not only the economy, but also the energy sector to be more reliable, less reliable on only one source. Okay, results. These are a lot of results. I thought sometimes it's like people are like, is there actually something coming out of it? For the 4 years that the climate leadership plan has been in place, it's quite impressive the amount of results that are already coming out of it, and that you can see every day already happening. So many projects. This is just a collection of things that already happened. And also when we talk about the emissions reductions, this is the trajectory that we were on when there were the 2 pie charts that I was showing. This is the trajectory we were on. This is where we are at right now. So you can already see the impacts, and it's already working, and we're already going into the right direction. So now what? We know that countries that have been successful in reducing their emissions over time, so these are 18 countries that were able to reduce their emissions over time. You can see most of them are in Europe. In Europe, there has been like policies working, a price on carbon for a longer time, so it's already showing results. But the key is that you need to have strong policies. You need to have commitment. You need to have leadership on that. So we need to continue if you want to decarbonize while strengthening or diversifying Alberta's economy. We need to continue to address climate change, and we need to make that in a smart way where we can have competitive industry, invest in making sure that the resources we produce are produced in the cleanest way, and we diversify our economy, and at the same time we take care of our communities by, for example, making sure that the transition from coal communities into different jobs is done in a respectful and supportive way. This is numbers from a report that we actually worked with AFL together on, and they're gonna get released soon. So I think I was allowed to make a sneak peek. You said like you're gonna share some numbers, right? So that's okay? Okay. So here's some numbers. These are the potential job numbers that are part of the transformation of the economy in the different areas, and it's around oil and gas industry. So as I said, there is like still a need to like figure out how we can transition, but why we transition, let's make sure we invest in clean tech, and then transportation and infrastructure, electricity, and buildings. And then one thing I wanted to say, it can often be quite, that is my last slide, almost. Sometimes it can be like you hear about these things and it's like, oh my God, how do I fit into this? And for me, it's good to know that there are all these different things that I can do that help to impact where we are right now and reduce emissions, and we can all do something. Like there is this things that we can do at home, like putting our clothes on a like hanging thing, and I don't know how you call it, using less plastic bags. Like all these things are connected and all of them help us to reduce our emissions, and as a community we can work on them together. And there are things that have a higher impact on emissions, like for example reducing the amounts of flights that we do. And for example, but I know, like I'm from Germany, I want to see my family, so I do have to fly, but I try to fly as little as possible. So there are different things and different scales, but there's a lot of things we can do. But apart from that, as I said, like if we really want to have on a large scale an impact, and what we need is leadership on a political level. So we need to make sure that on one hand, politicians know that this is something we care about. We want to make sure that to a lower carbon economy at the same time as we diversify our economy and look into where we go as a province in the future and how we can transition into a more sustainable energy future. And so letting them know that this is important, holding them accountable and making sure they deliver on these policies and make sure that they deliver on them and bring them forward. And then one thing I wanted to show, that's a project of ours. It's called the New Energy Economy Map and the website. And we show that this is not something that is kind of out there 10 years or something. This is like happening right now. People, Albertans all over the province are doing projects around renewables, energy efficiency, clean tech, transportation. So all of these dots are people doing projects, being engaged, doing their own thing, and they have different motivations. Some do it to reduce emissions, some do it to have a different income, some do it because they care about new technology. So all of these people are doing cool projects, and it's happening right now in Alberta. So it's not like this is out there, it's already happening, and it's where the world is going. So we better make sure we are part of it. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much to Yulia and Gil. We now have some time for Q&A. If anybody has some questions, if you're not comfortable with the microphone, there is paper and pens on your tables. You can write it down and we will read those out.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm a member of IATSE 212. I have a question for Gil. With regards to the labor movement, and I believe that we as a labor movement have a big role to play. However, I find that within our society, we're convinced that by the powers that be, that we have more power as consumers rather than as workers. So you often get, well, you know, as consumers, you can do this or you can do that, or you can, you know, eat less meat, so you can, you know, do this over here. But we also know that it's 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of the increase in CO2s. So is there any chance within the labor movement that we can start seeing this from the point of view as producers and start saying to the companies that we work for that we want this in our contracts, that we want, you know, windmills and we want solar panels on the tops of the roof, and if we don't get it, we're going to go on strike?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. One of the reasons that workers get together in unions in the first place is because we understand that together we have more power and influence than if we try to act individually. And that's true at the bargaining table, but it's also true in the political arena and on these bigger issues that you're talking about, including issues like climate change. I would argue that here in Alberta, over the last 3 years, we've seen the influence that unions and working people can have on public policy related to these important issues, just through the interaction that we've had with this government. And I sort of want to emphasize the importance of having a government that's willing to work with working people. That was our first big win, back in May of 2015. The labor movement came together, helped elect a government that shared our priorities and values. And it wasn't just because we were for Team Orange. We understood that if people with those values and priorities got elected, they'd start taking action on the issues that we were concerned about. So New Democrats formed government, and then we were able to sit down with them and talk about a whole range of issues that we'd never been able to talk about with previous governments, right? So we started talking, about the climate leadership plan and what it meant for working people. And this was this wasn't academic for us because, a lot of the people were losing their jobs as a result of the coal phase out, which was part of the climate leadership plan. Almost all of them were unionized workers, both in the coal mines and the coal-fired power plants. And so because we had a government that was willing to sit down with us, we negotiated a just transition for them. So, and it's the first in the world. I think the first comprehensive just transition program there've been bits and pieces in other parts of the world. Germany's been pretty good, but the whole package, right? So when we approached it like it was collective bargaining, we called it political bargaining, and so we got education vouchers for the younger workers so they could retrain. We got pension bridging for the older workers. We got supports for the community, so for those people who wanted to stay in the communities and not have to move. Some job creation initiatives. That's the kind of thing that workers can do together through their unions, working with open-minded governments. So just transition programs. And yeah, I agree with you. That's one of the reasons we put together a 12-point plan, because we think as workers, we should have a say in the economy in which we work in. And that's why, like, a lot of people think, oh, workers should just talk about wages and benefits and stuff. But no, we work at the front. We're literally and figuratively, we're at the coal face. We're at the front lines, and we're doing the work. And so we know what can change. We have some ideas that perhaps the employers don't. But also, we worry about the next job for ourselves, for our kids. So we desperately have to have a say in the future of the economy. That's why we've put together this blueprint for a transformation in the Alberta economy, like focusing on diversification, investment in infrastructure, a bridge to a greener future. But individually, workers wouldn't be able to have leverage in that kind of conversation, but we do because we work together in unions. And the final thing I'll say on that point is that Europe has this very well-established practice of what they call social dialogue, right? It's expected that when governments and businesses are making big decisions about the economy and investment, and that's tripartite. Like they have these structures that exist where they don't make decisions by themselves. It's always business, government, and labor. That's kind of outside of our tradition here in North America, but it's one of the things that we've proven through our just transition work here in Alberta, that it actually makes the outcomes better, not just for the workers, but for everyone.
And Germany is actually looking towards Alberta to learn from the just transition thing. Yeah.
Anybody else have questions?
Yeah, for those who are not familiar with the acronyms, the labor movement is like an alphabet soup of acronyms. So CUPW, CUPW is the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and the brother presented them as an example of what a union can do in terms of negotiating with their employer on issues related to the green economy. So CUPW at the bargaining table has been going to their employer, Canada Post, and pitching ideas about greening their fleet of vehicles. So electric vehicles. They've introduced a whole bunch of different ideas about how the business can be run in a way that is more sustainable and more in keeping with the goals of the Paris Accord. And so that's a really good concrete example here in Canada. But that kind of bargaining is going on all around the world. I know European unions are bringing those kind of ideas to the table. It's happening in the States. It's happening in all sorts of sectors. And like Yulia was saying, this is a community effort. Like the world is moving in this direction, and the labor movement already is part of that. And we've made a contribution. And I think working people, working through the unions, they should get excited about the prospects, about the difference we can make by being at the table.
Okay, thanks again for speaking for us tonight. And thank you everybody who came out tonight to attend and our online guests. Our next event for the speaker series will be Wednesday, March 13th at the Edmonton office. The topic will be labor standards. We hope you can all attend and participate, or you can join us online.